Cinematologists podcast presents The Films of Alice Diop. On today's episode, Neil and Dario discuss the French filmmaker Alice Diop, using 4 of her films currently streaming on MUBI UK as a guide. They talk about Towards Tenderness, On Call, We, 3 of her documentaries, and her debut feature, the much acclaimed Saint Omer. The conversation covers Diop's formidable formal approaches in both narrative and documentary, and how she blurs the lines between the two through her thematic repetitions and formal dexterity. Neil and Dario are blown away by the body of work that they have spent time with over the past month, and get to grips with Diop's themes of love, vulnerability, immigration and the diaspora, womanhood, motherhood, and language. Dario recorded his part on the road in Cologne while examining a PhD, and Neil recorded his part from his new home office in his new house in Falmouth. And he promises next time he'll have a pop shield. On with the show. Welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Neil Fox, and joining me down the line from somewhere in Europe is Dario Linares. Hello, Dario.
Somewhere in Europe. It sounds like, you know, the intro to a beginning text to some kind of futuristic film where the whole of Europe has descended into chaos. From somewhere in Europe. I'm actually in Cologne right now in a very nice apartment in the south of the city. Was in Ghent for the weekend with B, so we had a kind of, weekend breaky type thing, and now I've moved on my own to Cologne because I'm examining a PhD. Friend of ours, Anne Korfmacher, is doing her PhD on podcasting, and interesting experience to sort of go through a PhD viva not in the UK. So I obviously read her thesis, and that's to come tomorrow, but I've got the day off today, so I'm going to record with you and then go on a flaneur around the city.
Sounds delightful. Yeah, you were in Antwerp, weren't you? Which I've never been to Antwerp, but I saw it recently in Alain Robbe-Grier's Trans-Europe Express, so it seemed like an interesting place. So what did you make of it? Yeah,
actually, staying in Ghent, but we took a day trip to Antwerp, which was very nice actually, because we went to Central Museum of Fine Arts, but it had quite a lot of modern art in as well. And it was interesting because it was sort of it wasn't curated chronologically. It was done by theme. So really interesting. You get really interesting sort of juxtapositions. So you'd see a Rubens next to a Magritte, or a Martin de Vos next to a Wouters or someone like that, and it had a sort of interactive element to it, which sometimes I think with art galleries can be a little bit gimmicky, but this one I thought worked quite well. There was this room where all of the entire room was sort of a panoramic cinema screen, and it did these sort of movements of environment, let's say, from one side to the other, so you could kind of follow it around. And if you sat there for a little while, it had a very immersive effect, a sort of weird sense of the idea of space changing and your mood changing because of that. So that was quite interesting as well. But
sounds great. I have had not the same level of cultural delight. I have been immersed in flat packing and unpacking, and so we moved in just over a week ago to the house finally in Falmouth, and so today's recording, I have no idea how this is going to sound. It's a very echoey room, I think, because I don't have any stuff in this room at the moment, and I'm on a busy main road. It's one day where we actually don't have any workmen in, but they've put some scaffolding up next door, so they're starting work. So this is giving me a new ambience for listeners, which I shall iron out over the next few episodes. But yes, it might sound like I'm in an exotic locale, but I'm just in the front room office, which is very nice. I'm very happy with. So yeah, that's been what I've been up to, is just working through the unpacking of a new house.
But it's nice to be in the space, isn't it? And because you've been, struggling to get in because of having to do initial work. So actually getting in the environment and then trying to figure stuff out is a relief, I think, probably for you.
Oh, it's a massive relief, yeah. And we've got a lot done in a week. I think I sent you a picture the first night where it was like the DVDs are out, the Blu-rays are out, the TV's on. So priorities have been made. And we've just been doing a bit by bit.
Beds or kitchen or anything like that. As long as the DVDs are accessible, then you're fine to go.
Exactly. I just couldn't be without them for a moment longer. It'd been 2 months, and I was like, this is too long. But yeah, no, it's been a relief. It's been really nice. We really love the house, and kids love it. So yeah, it's been, and I've been on annual leave as well. So it's just been nice to just do that work. Really, I've been sending you probably very boring updates of like shelves I'm building or carpets I'm laying or whatever. So that's my exciting life. But I'm really enjoying it, actually. It's been really, really rewarding.
No, there's nothing like getting a completed flat pack shelving unit sent to you. It's just the highlight of the day for sure. So this episode is a little bit on the fly for me anyway, because obviously I'm away. But I'm in the process of editing an upcoming episode, which is much more of an audio documentary episode on cinema and its connection with the psychoanalytic professions from the 1950s to the 1970s, which is based on some research that's been done by a couple of academics in collaboration with the British Science Museum. So that's taking a little bit more time. So we decided that we're going to do a kind of interim episode, and we were thinking what to talk about. And Neil and I had both seen Saint Omer recently, the Alice Diop film, and we realised that MUBI had quite a few of her other works, which were all documentaries up to this point. Saint Omer is her first feature. So we were both kind of blown away by Saint Omer in various ways, but I think also it sort of inspired the possibility of some interesting avenues of discussion in a broader sense. So we thought we'd do a little bit of a retrospective, Neil.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, kind of fortuitous, really. You were like, what should we do? And I was about to embark on, watching the Alice Diop films that were on MUBI, and thought, this would be a really good opportunity to just talk together about a filmmaker and a collection of films. And it was, kind of a nice excuse, really, to sit down with her work that was presented on MUBI and really think about it, rather than just kind of Saint Omer as a 2023 release, or as a kind of fiction film or whatever, just as kind of part of a body of work, which we've done a few times, but I find increasingly interesting to do in this way. And it's really helpful, I find, at the moment, to kind of focus my viewing in these ways, to sort of, the newsletter helps with this. So it's like, what am I going to watch this month? How am I going to sort of focus my watching, knowing that there's going to be a chance to reflect on it at the end of the month for our Patreon subscribers. And so this is sort of aligned really, really well. And I have to say that it's been kind of revelatory experience watching her work, and also engaging with some other sort of interviews and things that she's given, and sort of there's a lot of sort of reading and listening that I've been doing that sort of added a context which has just been so rich and fascinating, and I can't wait to kind of dig into it a bit. It's really been sitting with me, in really sort of profound ways, I think, her body of work, and I'm sure that it has in similar ways for you.
Yeah, definitely. I think that starting from the most recent piece of work and working backwards, I mean, there are 4 of her films on MUBI, so those are the ones I've seen, obviously, but there are 8 in total and 7 of them are documentaries. And yeah, interesting sort of working backwards. Is that what you did, Neil? Did you sort of work backwards, or did you get them in chronological order, as it were, forwards?
I think I did them slight chronological. Yeah, I did Towards Tenderness first, and then I did On Call, and then I did We, and then I finished with Saint Omer. So that was the order that I did it. So did you do it a different way?
Yeah, I worked backwards. So that'd be interesting, actually, because you'll be able to speak more to whether you can see a definite kind of development, in terms of style or interest, theme.
Yeah.
Monsieur l'huissier, faites entrer l'accusé. Messieurs, vous pouvez désentraver l'accusé. Veuillez indiquer à la cour vos noms et prénoms, votre date et votre lieu de naissance, ainsi que les noms et prénoms de vos parents.
Je m'appelle Laurence Colly. Je suis née le 15 mars 1980 à Dakar, au Sénégal. Mon père s'appelle Robert Colly. Ma mère Odile Diatta.
Quelle est votre profession?
Étudiante.
But I think what's interesting is to come to Saint Omer as the first feature and then go back to the documentaries, and you get a sense of her interest in modes of storytelling and how they both evoke a sense of truth, but also the idea that storytelling is also grounded in subjective experience, and that subjective experience is defined in and of itself by someone's context but in the broadest sense of that, their sense of their own history and what that actually might mean to them. So there's a kind of working through of what does it mean to be a person who lives in a country that has a certain kind of heritage, and how does that relate to the other people in your community, in your family, in your city, and then particularly when you come to Saint Omer, that sort of sense of what does it mean to have an affinity with another person who is going through something that on the outside is being judged as being highly as horrific, as problematic an act as you can probably imagine. The idea of somebody killing their own child, especially a woman killing their own child, and all of the terrible sort of taboos that elicits, but then also interestingly how the character who is watching, observing from the side, is kind of thinking to themselves, but what is my relationship to this person, in both the observer but also having a kind of affinity in terms of identity, in terms of being a woman, in terms of potentially being a mother. And I think that idea of what it means to be an observer and telling a story but being implicated in that story is so key to her work generally, but that sort of observational style, which I think is being commented upon, even though it's being used at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's similar to sort of a lot of my responses to it. It's been interesting because before I watched any of the films, I heard her give a talk at, I think it was New York Film Festival, with Frederick Wiseman, and then read the Sight and Sound interview with Claire Denis. And so I kind of had in my mind those filmmakers just as kind of, I guess, dialogue points. when I started the work, and it's kind of amazing how her work sits in a space between those two, you know, that she spends a lot of time with people and focuses on them, but there's an intimacy and a sensitivity sort of and a tactility to a lot of her work that strikes me as very kind of Claire Denis. And also the use of ellipsis, you know, this the way she moves through time and space, and creates this kind of tapestry of feeling and, like you said, truth, which I think is really interesting, like the truth of the matter at hand, and in its kind of messiness, but it never feels like it's presented messily. It's presented very, very formally and very sensitively in terms of her subjectivity as a filmmaker. So those sort of points of reference were there. And then I read a really fascinating interview with her last night where she was talking about her love of Chantal Akerman.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think that there's a lot in the construction of imagery and her focus on space and the disembodied space, really. And you know, that I think I find it really, so that I kind of, that's almost sort of seeing her in that tradition and how her work kind of moves across all three of those kinds of filmmakers, but also brings with it a very kind of sociological subjectivity,
sure,
a very kind of bold and confident anchoring in terms of Black experience, immigrant experience, diasporic experience, and the experience of women as a kind of statement of you know, validity, which I think is something that Denise done in her work, you know, kind of giving bodies that don't get that on-screen representation a kind of a poetic and, you know, kind of open and complex representation. I think she takes from there, but there's a very specific subjectivity to it that I think is kind of startling when you see the work all lined up, and it does culminate, I think, in Saint Omer in a really fascinating way, in terms of thinking about those filmmakers and how this is a narrative, but how it uses many modes of kind of observational documentary to make its points cinematically.
Yeah, and sort of maybe to go back to the first film then, and we'll finish on Omer. So on Call is the most formally straightforward version of observational doc, I would say, out of the three documentaries before we get to Saint Omer.
Yeah.
And it's essentially just tells a series of stories of immigrants who are coming into this hospital in a suburb of Paris, and you have this it's the series of consultations with these patients as they come in with a doctor called Jean-Pierre Guiret. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's interestingly sort of sits between the discussions of the patient's kind of medical problems, but then, you know, little by little, he asks them sort of greater contextual questions about, you know, where they're from. Most of them are from Africa, and what their situation is in terms of their status, and how those two things kind of fit together in terms of what their experiences are right now. So they're working, you know, there's this question of how each of the immigrants are working their way through the bureaucratic system, what treatments they require, but then also, you know, their sort of past histories that come out through these conversations. And the camera never really leaves the consulting room, does it, at all? I don't think there's any exterior shot outside. So all you get are these articulations, these expositional stories, which, you know, and I think that it's that radical sort of forensic lens into the articulation of the stories that over time builds up the sort of little moments of emotions, as whether it's, you know, and a lot of it is based on the pain of the experiences that they've had, that you get to the moments of joy or revelation, or the characters getting in touch with their emotions. I mean, there's a couple of heartbreaking. Well, there's quite a few sort of heartbreaking moments. There's a woman at one point who just completely loses it, and the doctor is being assisted a lot of the time by a psychiatrist, and they're trying to reckon with not only the sort of singular medical issues that somebody might have, but how they are related to the mental states of the patients. If there's ever a film that sort of collapses that idea of mind-body dualism, the idea that you get the sense, I don't know whether you felt this, that all of the symptoms that these people are feeling are in some way a result of their circumstances, in a broader sense, whether it's economic or just to do with the traumas of the journeys that they've been on and having to leave their families behind and all of this kind of thing. But that comes through little by little because there is nowhere else to look. Essentially, Diop puts the camera and doesn't move it, and that's her directorial intervention. You know what I mean? Obviously, no, I'm not going to give you a place to kind of escape here. You have to engage with that, and I think it does reflect that sort of almost a sort of formalist insistence as a documentary filmmaker that she has.
Absolutely, yeah, and it grows as an experience, as you said, because you are so confined with these people, both the doctor, the psychiatrist, and the patients. And then there's moments where you kind of glimpse, the door opens and you glimpse the waiting room, and it kind of feels like a breath, but it's also loaded because you can see other patients that you've seen waiting to come in. There's a real kind of purpose to the way that she shows things, and then the other sort of glimpse you get is beyond the room that the consultations happen in, which is the kind of the admin room where you have this administrator who pops in every now and again and feels very different in terms of her personality and her approach to these people than the doctor and the psychiatrist, who have these really kind of warm and human and complex and honest conversations, which almost feel confined to this room and this room alone, and then the world outside does not have these conversations. Sure. And the sort of the thing I sort of said to myself as I was going through is like, where are these conversations happening in cinema? It's almost like they're only happening in this room. Yeah. These really deep examinations of immigrant experience from a very human place. It's kind of overwhelming in its simplicity. Like you say, the formalism of it is so purposeful. I watched a film which I talked about in the newsletter last month called Talking About Trees, which is about Sudanese filmmakers trying to reopen cinemas in Sudan. And one of the sort of the takeaways from that is how modern oppression, repression, dictatorships, colonialism, empire, all these kind of, how the tools of has shifted into bureaucracy. And so much of the things that stand in the way and all, like you say, so kind of tire these people when they get to, is such an obfuscatory bureaucracy that is designed to not let them in, almost as if to say, well, we understand we have signed up to a refugee charter, asylum charter, whatever it is, but we're going to make it so difficult for people to access it. And you can feel the exasperation on both the patients, but also the doctor, who just he's using every ounce of his being to get around so much hostile environment paperwork to these people. And it's exhausting because it's rooted in this one space, which is, not even a nice space. It's a very banal space to have to engage in this work, and it's interesting. It was interesting to see it after towards Tenderness, and then before and feel the strength of Diop's decisions, because it feels like a very different mode of filmmaking compared to those films. But it feels so intentional. Like she's very in touch with, actually, this is the way I'm going to approach this subject, and these are the decisions I'm making. So that presence is felt in those decisions, and yeah, it's kind of extraordinary, I think, in terms of her ability to capture so much complexity and nuance with a very direct and simple approach, which is not lazy or simplistic.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting how her lens also goes to the doctor and the psychiatrist just as much, in terms of how this is affecting them. And, you know, throughout the film, those, you know, those two they're not lacking in empathy, but there's always a sense of calm detachment to them, which struck me as a kind of defense mechanism. Because if you were too overly empathetic and too, you know, consoling, like everything is going to be all right.
Yeah.
You know, first of all, you're not telling somebody the truth, but second of all, how do you would be allowing the trauma to kind of affect you. And in order to do their jobs, there is a sort of sense of, look, I'm just going to have to listen to your story and you know, have a conversation with you, but I can't get too involved because, you know, you'd have to go home and just sort of, you know, you'd be an emotional wreck every single day. So it's interesting how they both have to adhere to the bureaucratic mentality while demonstrating levels of empathy, so that the patients know that they are actually talking to somebody who's listening to them in that sense. But yeah, it's a very
it captures listening really well.
It does.
It captures listening really well.
Yeah. So I mean, again, to me it was probably my. I mean, I think this one, along with Saint Omer, are the two that without a doubt kind of work in their own conceptualization. Do you know what I mean? I think it's interesting watching that and then thinking about Towards Tenderness, which is similar in the sense of it's using the dialogue of a series of male characters, for want of a better word, or male subjects, if we're talking about documentary, or participants, reflecting on their understanding of the nature of relationships, but it separates out the dialogue. So you get an overtrack, you get voiceovers, and then you get just images of these guys, really. And so, you know, there's a sense in which the voiceover is acting as their psychological thoughts rather than them being interviewed to camera. So it has much more of that separation. But I mean, but this is really interesting, particularly in the context of, you know, conversations about toxic masculinity and you know, which seem to be at the forefront of you know, a lot of commentary in cinema and wider popular culture at the moment. But this was made in 2016, and I found this really sad in a way, but also kind of indicative of when we think about the problems of how to define masculinity in contemporary society, and how we might think about the way in which boys are raised, really, you know, not in individual families, but just generally by society, and what their expectations are of themselves in relationship to women. And particularly, I think there's also a sort of class and racial element here that is the undercurrent of their attitudes towards women. It's just, yeah, it's really quite, at times I found it quite sickening, and I just thought to myself, you know, yeah, I mean, again, as a parent, that's the sort of big difference between us when we're watching, you know, something like this. It's like I wonder how this reads to a parent when you think about some of the things that these guys are saying in terms of their sense of their own identity, and the problematic ways in which their identity revolves around a particularly controlling and often quite misogynistic attitude towards women.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting being a man and watching it and thinking about, if we, to continue your parent, line there before I sort of say other stuff, like thinking about my life as a man and where I feel I've succeeded and failed, thinking a lot in terms of failure as a man in the last year, in terms of values that I haven't necessarily lived up to, and how that is going to impact my daughter and my son, the world that my daughter's going to grow up in, and how I have not lived the values that I necessarily wanted to, or should have done in some ways, and how that's that's there in the fabric of my life, and both the very personal and the very kind of complex societal reasons why I've thought certain things and behaved certain ways, and where that line is in terms of responsibility and that kind of thing. And it is hard to see that kind of representation so messily rendered, and messily in the sense of what I found really fascinating about Towards Tenderness was how that there was a lot of very open, honest kind of owning of misogyny and control and subjugation. It was unusual that these were not men who kind of presented a sort of men's rights activist identity, but a kind of, this is who I am, and this is why. There was a really kind of stunning line where one of the men says, "It's hard to talk about love. We don't know what it is," and that really comes across that these are men who are, unable to express themselves in any other way, but the blame is never laid simply at the door of society and culture. They are implicit in its kind of propagation, which I think is kind of amazing.
Then there's amazing lack of apology here, and that's the thing that you kind of reflect on, really, when a lot of representations of men are either one side of the other of what you've just talked about. They're either kind of like over men's activists, where we've been fucked over now, so it's time for our revenge, as it were, by the feminization of society, whatever you want to call it. Or it's very much a kind of redemption story of, I realized I've been a bad man for whatever reason, and I'm going to do better, and these are and now I recognize my own sort of culpability in misogyny, in either in an individual or a broader sense. But there's that is absent here, and I think it's just and it's actually fascinating to listen to just how much the idea of love and in a more deeper sense, kind of just basic vulnerability is something that these characters are completely on guard against. And even interestingly, when they're talking about homosexuality, they talk about it in a way that's completely different to other versions of, the idea that homosexuality is bad, for want of a better word. Those sort of sense of that sense of they weren't really sort of decrying the sort of act of homosexuality as somehow problematic for them. It's the fact that it sounds terrible, but for want of a better word, if it's them doing it as it were, rather than having it done to them. And I'm sorry, I'm really wording that terribly. You have to watch it to really get a sense of the way that it's worded by the characters. Then that's fine because they're in control. So it's just a fascinating sense of what actually, what the act of sex actually means to them. I got the sense that there's no pleasure. It's just the fact that they wanted to show to their friends, to their peer group, that they are in control of a sexual situation, so they couldn't be defined as being weak or, to use their terminology, a faggot in that sense,
Yeah. And it's kind of stark, isn't it? Like you say, that the use of language and the use of ideas around this stuff is very starkly rendered. They never talk about as if they have a right to treat women like this, or to, it's just, these are the facts of our lives, and they live with those facts, and those are the facts, and they present them as if they are unshakable. And that's where a lot of the sadness comes in, and I think that the decision from Diop to focus so much on the idea of love is so bold, because, it's almost at this stage a kind of, white middle class preserve in many ways, of like the idea of like a loving family and a loving childhood. And, you just, the realization that, that these men, like a lot of men, but like a lot of children the world over, fundamentally missed out on the most important thing when they were growing up, which was just to be loved, and that, the space for the answers, which are big, both in On Call and towards Tenderness, in terms of what can be done to resolve these situations, is kind of, it just sits there, and it sits there in the fabric of the film, with the audience kind of having to sort of acknowledge that, without being wanky, but love is the answer, like loving human beings, embracing people and caring for people and being vulnerable, and, opening up in a world which is so starkly violent and aggressive at every turn is kind of the only way to really address these fundamental things with these men. And what was, just to go back to something else you were saying before, you were sort of saying about, that you responded to the kind of the formalism of Saint Omer and On Call more than these, and these the kind of searching. This was a searching film, as is We. I think, I would agree with that, but they were the films where I felt the Denis most closely, where there is a what she does in Towards Tenderness is what she does kind of in all of her films in smaller ways, but here it's the central formal approach, which is the kind of the rupture between sound and image, so there is always a conversation between what we are seeing and what we are hearing. She does this in kind of more Ackerman ways in other films, where we see these empty spaces and we hear these conversations, and there's a space that grows in that. But here it's the kind of the formal thesis of the film, but there was such a sensuality there because of these images which had no sound, and then this very, very intimate and very charged conversations that were being had on the soundtrack. I found that really moving as a formal thing. And I think the searching for me was the point, as it was in We, like that there is no, whereas on Call, you feel the presence of a filmmaker saying, this is what I want to present as my idea, and almost as an argument. Whereas in Towards Tenderness, it's like, I want to give these people the space to be themselves in the complexity of that, and I'm going to guide it in a kind of, in an ideological way through the questions, but I'm not going to present a kind of box. It's going to be much, much more chaotic than that. And that's what's kind of striking is that she can kind of flip between those two modes, and have very different formal experiences, but all rooted in these ideas of empathy. I think, she feels like a filmmaker who's interested in presenting empathy, as an idea throughout her work in a way that's not just a kind of very base sympathy, or like letting people off the hook, but about actually trying to engage with a person's wholeness in these really kind of cinematic ways. Like, it's so cinematic Towards Tenderness, like just the experience of it.
Yeah, and you get with the. It's interesting because you do get the images and the voiceovers are obviously separate, but the way that they're synced then back together does give you a sort of entry point, which is, you feel that it's psychological as much as just somebody telling their story, which I think is interesting when you move on to We, because I think that this is the moment where, if the first two films are much more observational or much more, the film director trying to sort of stay out of the way of what is being shown. I think Diop with We and Saint Omer is definitely, turning the lens back on herself, while still sort of offering these observational pictures of life. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I found We was the one I found the most difficult to watch in terms of, where is this going? What are the connection points here? It's the most abstract one, I think, in that sense, but also sort of starts to turn the lens on that idea of the relationship to the mother, which obviously comes through in Saint Omer. So what did you make of We?
I loved it. I really loved it. And I loved it because it was both very simple. I loved the idea of like, this is the unifying idea is, and it's interesting that your language there was around, connection points and where is this going? Because obviously that's the idea of the film, is that these are people whose lives are lived on a train line. So the Rare B train line out of Paris, which is a commuter line, very, very popular, very busy line, and I loved the way that the film felt like stepping off the platform and wandering around different stations and engaging with the lives of people there and seeing what comes out of that idea. It's a very kind of Parisian flaneur kind of idea,
sure,
of let's just take the journey and see what's along the way. And yeah, the way that slowly across the film she sort of almost gains the confidence. I think it was shot over a few years in bits and pieces to place herself on that line, like you say, with sort of family stories, both home movies but also kind of interviews, and then herself as well in kind of conversation. She almost across the film steps into it and sort of says like, here I am, and it shone a different light on those stories. And I just, similar to kind of both On Call and Towards Tenderness, I think she's got a gift for spending small amounts of time with people, but capturing something of them, which sounds really pretentious and kind of wispy, but I felt like the time she spent with these people was really meaningful in terms of allowing us to see them in kind of fascinating ways and seeing her fascination with these people, and then moving on without it being like, oh, that would have been a great subject for a documentary on their own. They fit into the context of the whole in really kind of amazing ways. And I just loved, I think I loved the journey aspect of it, and popping up here, popping up there with these different people and sort of getting glimpses of their lives, and just feeling like, that these were people that you just don't see. You just don't see these lives on screen, and she's actually taken this journey to find out who these people are, where they live, and what they do in I thought a really beautiful way. I thought it was fascinating, and again loved the way she sort of chose each character to have their own kind of formal, or each set of characters, I should say, have their own formal representation in the whole. It's all over the shop in terms of the way she films, the way she records sound for each of, each character gets their own kind of formal approach, which often doesn't work. But I found, because it was rooted around this central idea of the train line, kind of worked in this way, in a way that it wouldn't work if you just did it when you popped into one place. It was the different spaces of it that really sort of connected for me.
Yeah. And And the individual stories were really interesting. I thought, I really liked that there was the car mechanic guy, and the sort of nurse or home carer, and the sort of time in which that was taken to sort of see their everyday lives, and the fact that they're both sort of surviving on their own terms, but it's also they were both kind of giving very much, or helping other people. That was their sort of mode of survival at the same time. It was almost as if that they felt that they were actually quite lucky, which was really interesting because, from a Western eye, you look at that and you think, oh, these guys, these lives are really hard. But I don't think that they sort of felt that way. And what really sort of blew my mind, or the thing that really affected me, was when she one of the segments where she was doing the voiceover herself and sort of talking about her parents. And there's that moment where she said she was talking about that the whole family were paying in to a fund so that when they were dead, they could be taken back to Senegal and be buried back in Senegal, right? And she recounted this story about how her father had said to her, look, you need to start paying into this fund yourself so that then you can be sent back. And your remains could be sent back when you die. And like, first of all, that's a really interesting story in terms of the idea of the planning for your mortality in one sense. But then, the idea of there is a, for want of a better word, the roots that immigrants are always looking back to. And in a very different way, I have a similar sort of feelings about my own heritage in terms of being half Spanish and where that lays. So I was kind of thinking about that. But then when she sort of said that she had said to her father, well, I'm not going to pay into this because I don't want my remains to be sent back. I actually want to be buried here. And she said something, I think I'm paraphrasing here, but the silence was pregnant of the meaning of what that actually meant.
Yeah.
And it was just that, without actually saying it, there was a sort of a recognition that she was not Senegalese, she was Parisian, and there was now a complete disjuncture between what her parents thought they were and now what she realizes she is in terms of the relationship to her context, in terms of where she's living, and the idea of being French and born there, and being a black French woman in a modern world, and all of these kinds of things, and without actually having to say it in words like I've just done there, there was so much in that particular moment, I thought, that was really interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. And then it links her to the other participants in the film, the people who have made that journey.
Yeah.
And if they are, and their legacies, their families, in terms of that they've left behind, the families that they're building, the future families, the kind of the black teenage girls, what it means to be black, French, immigrant, diasporic, woman, and agency, and just again the simplicity of the the filmmaking kind of is really kind of connected to kind of complex ideas in such fascinating ways, and then I loved the way that she carried that through in terms of, like, what's interesting about thinking about We and Saint Omer is like how she brings forth some of the filmmaking aspects. There's a lot of the kind of very formal compositions, use of kind of color, particularly empty space, but also how she then brings forth her own story from We into Saint Omer, in these kind of home movies, bringing forth the kind of the cinematic ideas into that film, so that and she does say this in an interview, like that. What are the differences between her documentary and her fiction work? Because if you look at them formally, thematically, there isn't a difference. All that's different is literally one is scripted with different character names, and the others are participants that have been found that represent themselves on screen. And that connective tissue between films is also in the films themselves. You know, she's able to connect all these ideas together using cinema, formal ideas, which I think is kind of breathtaking, you know, in terms of the way she's able to do it. And, you know, speaking as an academic, I think it's fascinating that's her route, you know, as a kind of academic, and kind of thinking, the thinking is present, you know, like thinking through these ideas and kind of trying to present them in a unified way for the purpose of the object at hand is it feels very academic in the kind of the best type of academic thinking, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's also, just before we move on to Saint Omer, I think that it's so at odds with the way in which the idea of immigration, if I'm going to use that, you know, there's loads of different ways I could phrase it, like diaspora, as you've done. But that sense of the immigrant story is so in depth in terms of the way that it's formally shown, but the stories that are being told are not given a kind of either a narrative or discursive framework that we're used to seeing. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you watch the news in the UK for any length of time, that the way in which the framework by which how we can speak about immigration is very, very bounded, you know, and it puts you on one side or the other of a very black and white idea. Whereas here, you know, that the level of patience and concentration that is required, which, you know, you could define as academic in the way that the requirement of the audience to engage with the film is so at odds with what we're used to seeing. And that's why it looks so radical, I think, when you're watching her films. And then when you come to something like Saint Omer, and I think that there is a sort of, again, a move forward in the awareness of what she's trying to do as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
What can you do?
And as you say, you know, it's based on the story of a character who is a literature professor and a novelist who is pregnant, and the character's name is Rama, and played brilliantly. I mean, all the performances are really interesting because they have that sort of Brissonian reserve to them. But Rama's played by Kaije Kagame, and she is almost Alice Diop's surrogate, I think. You know, there's definitely a semi-autobiographical element here, who travels to Saint Omer, outside of Paris, to observe this trial of a character called Lawrence Coley, played by Guslaji Malanda. And so we get the story of this trial. Coley's a student, and again, a Senegalese immigrant who's accused of leaving her 15-month-old daughter on a beach to be swept away by the tide, essentially. And it is based on the Medea play, which interestingly I'd just seen a version of that in London starring Sophie Okonedo. So all of this kind of interesting notion of the story of the story of that play and the kind of taboos that are inherent within it in terms of, you know, the it's almost seen as the oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like the story of the ultimate judgment, you know, of a woman who has killed her own child, which interestingly, I think is still such a fundamental taboo in terms of, well, if any mother does that, they are inherently evil. And, you know, there is no black and white around such a heinous crime. But what's interesting about the play and then this film is the way in which that then is framed in the experiences of the character at its heart. So that this woman who's being judged in the trial, but then also how the character of Rama, who is observing the trial, and there's a sort of meta-fictional element of it, because you do know that this is the filmmaker who's setting up a person who is herself observing, how she comes to see the complex relationship with her own mother has echoes in what she's seeing in this trial and feeling in terms of a personal connection to the woman who is being accused, you know?
Yeah, and the Medea stuff is interesting because it comes up really early in the film where she's talking about this project to agent, I guess, and they sort of says, you know, that the notes came back and they don't really like the title, they don't really know who Medea is, you know?
Yeah.
And Rama's like, what do you mean they don't know who Medea is? Like, everyone knows who Medea is. And it's, you know, that's really interesting in terms of like this idea of myth and this idea of a kind of mythical understanding or correlation that we sort of have between, kind of female characters and women as sort of, you know, sentient, agentic human beings, and how the way this film, because it uses these transcripts from the trial in this kind of amazing way in terms of the way it incorporates it into the dialogue,
sure,
kind of really makes this really bold link between the roots of the Medea myth and the idea of womanhood and the role of the woman and the mother particularly, and you know, kind of the character of Lawrence Coley as this kind of avatar of a real person. Kind of, it just again really kind of makes you hone in on what is a myth and where do they come from, and what are we actually saying when we engage with these mythical ideas. Are we not just trying to find kind of narrativizing ways of acknowledging the complexities of humanity, which are sometimes very dark and we don't really understand? You know, I think it does that kind of amazing. And to go back to the kind of the idea of these characters, and particularly immigration, you know, in terms of the idea of the immigrant or the refugee or the asylum seeker, you know, what I loved about the start of this film was how, and I was like, in any other film you'd have a scene where Rama, because she's with her family at the start, so she spends time with her family before she goes away. She never tells them where she's going.
Sure. But
in any other film, you'd have this scene where they're like, she's like, I'm going to cover the trial of, you know, Lawrence Coley, and then everyone would have an opinion on it, and you'd have this very, you know, abrupt, kind of direct, you know, almost like Greek chorus of opinions about this woman and what she's done, and it's so interior. You know, it's so rooted in Rama as the person who's going to lead us through this narrative that it was striking. Like, oh, thank God they didn't do that. You know, she just turns up, and the echoes of that, you know, the echoes of that family time as we learn about Rama's life and that they unravel in these really interesting ways is just so it's handled so much better. And again, it's just, you just feel like this hand of a documentary filmmaker being like, this is not serving my story, this is not serving the truth of what I want to get at. So to be able to kind of switch into a scripted mode and do that, I think it was fantastic. And it just gives it just places us in that courtroom with Rama, and we're much more able to see the links that she's feeling in her connection to Lawrence Coley and what it means to her as a woman and as a, as a daughter and that kind of thing, in these ways which are so specific, but as the old saying goes, the specific is universal, and it becomes much more universal in terms of our ability to understand women, mothers, as human beings with kind of complex lives, and then particularly black women who have historically been treated in these kind of really oppressive ways, even in with the sphere of kind of women's experience, is so powerfully done. It's and then just kind of, again, through that kind of Wiseman use of time, spending a lot of time with someone explaining messily, not very coherently, because what can be coherent, what they've done, it just this power emerges, which is just kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find it messy at all. I just found it intellectually uncompromising in a way that I really sort of respected, and that's both in an aesthetic sense. I think that go ahead.
Sorry, what I meant is messy is in terms of her explanation is messy. It's not a very simple, direct. That's what I mean. But the film is not messy at all. But what she says about why she did it and is messy because it's a mess.
But there's no.
The film's not messy at all.
But in that sense, I think that it's kind of like. I'm not a fan of that word in this instance. Not to sort of say that you're wrong, Neil, but just to say that I think that. In a sense that she is the telling the story as she sees it. She is giving the truth as she understands what, and also saying she doesn't know when she doesn't know why in a direct sense, because everybody's searching for answers. So it's and I think there's so many elements of it that challenge preconceptions, I think, both in a cinematic sense but also in a thematic sense. So I can definitely see here the correlations with Ackerman in terms of the sort of radical formalism and the way that the camera is situated in the expositional elements that require, again, that sort of sense of patience and concentration to really understand what's going on here. For me, it needs a second watch, and I really hope I can catch it in the cinema at some sense, but at some point in the future. But what I really, really loved as well was how it attacked these subjects that are just taken for granted in the way that they're depicted. So, for example, the idea of a black female immigrant being, intellectually articulate and incredibly smart. And both women are. I mean, I think that at one point in the story, that it's interesting how she comments on how the newspapers are, they're writing in a tone as if to say, that the woman in the dock, this Senegalese woman she talks in this incredibly erudite way, and you can see that Diop is trying to say this is the way that popular culture depicts black women. They don't expect them to be smart and to be able to talk in that sense, to be able to articulate in that way. So it's playing around with that, and also the idea that the notion of motherhood has the possibility of undermining the autonomy of a female subject, I think, is at the heart of what is going on here. So the idea that this character, this woman, was a sense of herself, and the idea that was being lost because of motherhood, and that is a question then that Rama has to kind of think through herself, because you can see at these moments where she knows her life is going to change because she's about to have a baby, and she has this problematic relationship with her own mother. You get these flashbacks where the scenes around the kitchen of her younger self, and there's very much a sort of a distance between her and her mother, and that feeds into the relationship that she has with her sisters and her mother, right now, before, and as you say, the sort of elements of that at the beginning and at the end, and you see she's got this. Her husband is a white guy who, and you get these sort of senses of, who is my daughter going to be? What world am I bringing her into? And there's sort of the vivid descriptions of what is going on in the courtroom. There are complex moral arguments here that reflect how all of our actions are shaped by context, and it moves to that point of asking the question: is anything elementally wrong or right? And when we get the descriptions of Coley's backstory, it makes us begin to think slightly differently about the actions that she's taken. So yeah, it's really complex in that sense, and just worthy of sort of so much praise and dedicated time, I think, to sort of think through some of the things that are going on here.
Yeah, I've just been thinking there about what you said about the idea of the word messy not being adequate. Because I think you're right, that it's not. And the reason I've been thinking about it is because language is so important to this film, and it's important to Diop. She's talked a lot about the importance of language, and its complexity and intricacy, and in a kind of Derridian sense, insufficiency, and how the focus, particularly of the prosecution, is on language, and how the ambivalence and the ambiguity of the truth that Lawrence Coley shares is not adequate enough for what the perception of the crime and her acts is societally. There is a kind of tension between the expectation that it's a simple, understandable, kind of motive and reason, and what emerges is something which is more convoluted, more chaotic, more tortured, and kind of confusing in terms of the which, as you say, kind of is a kind of constant reminder that the more we actually spend time thinking, the more confusing, the more unpleasant, and the more kind of complex things become. And the fear that emerges of spending time in that space, and it's so interesting towards the end of the film where Rama says that she's scared she'll be like her.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of tension that rises in the gut, or it did for me, and it rises in Pierre, who's her partner, of like, who do you mean? Do you mean you're going to kill your child? But she says it's her own mother, But again, it's all in the language. I'm scared of being like her, and we end up focusing on the words because we want them to have a meaning which comforts us and makes us feel like we understand things. And at every turn, it can never do that, And I think it's such a beautiful film about that, I'm really pleased that you push back on the word messy, because it's not the right word. And it's, it would be unfair to this film to just let it be taken as the right word, because this film works so hard to remind us that there probably isn't the right word, but the searching for it and the sitting with the possibilities is what is something that we can do and should do way more than we normally do.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this conversation that we've had, I've felt the right word is messy, because I feel like I've kind of, it's such a difficult thing to articulate, the levels of kind of analysis, I think, that are going on here in a cinematic sense from the director. I mean, not from us in this sense, and it's almost kind of, I feel like I'm kind of scratching at the surface of the work here, and partly that might be to do with the sense that I am, our identities are so distant from the subjects that Diop is interested in, and her own experiences as well. And it's like, why should I have access to a clear understanding of what is going on here. But all you can do is kind of take the work as it is, I think. And yeah, like I say, it's a film I think that I'd really need to sort of see again, really, to have much more of an interesting, interesting's the wrong word, but much more of a kind of sense of how to work through the issues that I think that Diop is interested in here. And again, I don't think, I mean, if there is a messiness, I think maybe the director herself would sort of say that I'm not trying to draw conclusions here. And from some of the stuff that I've read, particularly like the Vanity Fair article, which I thought was really interesting, it's definitely not a case of a filmmaker just, discursively reaching answers.
No. And, in Yasmina Price's interview with her for Screen Slate, Price sort of opens the thing by sort of reminding people that, this is not a debut film. This is a filmmaker who's been working at a very high level for a very long time. So I think a lot of our inability to capture in an hour this filmmaker is because this is a major filmmaker who is working at a very, very high level. And we've both had very short, intense introductions to this filmmaker's work, which has kind of left us grappling with, both what we've seen and how to talk about it, which I think, is hopefully the result. It will be that, our listeners, if they're unaware of this filmmaker or if they haven't seen any of the other, we'll dig it out and similarly sit with that stuff, which is, the hope, isn't it? That's what our people's experience of listening to the podcast is, not just that we've waffled for an hour, but that we've tried to find a way into this incredible body of work and sort of, shone a light on it for people who might not necessarily know of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully we've done that at least. And, these films are available on MUBI. So, it's definitely worth kind of taking the time out, I think, to look at a body of work, on the back of what we say. So we can actually, don't take our word for it, just go and see the films. But there's a lot of stuff out there to actually read around Alice Diop. And I think that Saint Omer will hopefully afford her further opportunities to continue, on this trajectory of as this particular kind of unique filmmaker in many ways.
Yeah, well said. Miles was just popped in to add his weight to the Diop fan base.
No worries. Probably have something slightly more insightful than us to say, maybe.
Maybe, yes. I would. It wouldn't be hard. But no. I hope people have liked this hour-long trailer for Alice Diop's work. So yeah, thanks to our Patreon subscribers, thanks to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. Thanks, Dario, for I really love that conversation. Again, because I do enjoy just hearing you think through things and sort of being able to bounce my reactions off you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you're editing that one, not me, that's for sure. With all my pauses and hesitations, trying to think about what I'm actually meaning and saying. That was one of those where I was clearly aware that my thoughts and my speech were, more disconnected than they have been in recent episodes, maybe.
So maybe in honor of Diop and Frederick Wiseman, I'll just leave really, 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 really long pauses.
Podcast gold.
Cool. Yeah. So we'll be back soon with Dario's long-awaited kind of psychoanalytic exploration. But for now, thank you, Dario. Thank you, everyone. This has been the Cinematologists podcast. Thanks for listening.